Well, welcome to this special NAIDOC Week edition of Inside the Outhouse. My name's Pete Smith, founder, orator, and telemarketer, and I am joining you from the Gubby Gubby country this evening. And I'll just throw over to Maddie for an acknowledgement of country before we get started. Thanks, Maddie.
Good evening, all. So we'd like to take a moment to respect and honour the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, elders, past, present and future. We'd like to acknowledge the stories, traditions and living cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on this land and commit to building a brighter future together. I personally am on Wurundjeri land tonight and would like to particularly pay my respects to Wurundjeri elders, past, present and emerging. I'd be curious to find out the country that everybody else is coming from tonight. So if you just drop it in the chat, that'd be awesome.
Sorry about that lag. I was focused on something else. Thanks, Maddie, for that. So the topic tonight is food, glorious food. So we've got some food experts in the house because we all at times have managed food and eat food and probably have a relationship with food in the context of the outdoor program and specifically perhaps the outdoor expedition. But there's a gentleman in the room who's actually done some research into food, Mr. Brendon Munge from the University of the Sunshine Coast. And I'd like to just welcome him, and perhaps he could start us off by saying a few words about what his research has taught him about food in the outdoors, and then that perhaps will open up a conversation on this vital and interesting subject. Before I go, I'd just like to acknowledge the fine work of the management team of the Outhaus, Cherie, David, Maddie, Henry, and welcome back to the long-lost Ellen Barker, who has joined us this evening. And it's great to have you back in the room, and hopefully this is just the first of many, Ellen. Over to Brendon to have a few words about food.
Thanks, Pete, and thanks. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Oh, yep.
Perfect.
Wonderful to see you all, and recognition of I'm on Gubby Gubby country, and paying our respects to the elders here. We've got an emerging sort of culture within our university, which is really starting to thrive in terms of their recognition of the country, and it's wonderful to see. I guess from my perspective, food's always been a passion of mine, and I'm not very great at cooking it. I'm very good at consuming it. But on programs, I guess some time ago, I remember working for a company over in WA, and their whole basis of their product was based on a couple of things. And one was, what would students say when they go home and spoke to their parents about their program? And they knew that their parents would ask about food as one of the primary things. So food being did they have fun? Yep. Did you have something good to eat? Yep. So they made sure they had fresh food, and they were consistent with that. And from a leader's perspective, that was fabulous. Now, my research, and I don't rest alone on this research, it was with Adrian Forsyth and my partner, Jacqueline Munge, and Marcus Morse, and a few others. We looked at, I guess, food in the context of what the implications are for outdoor leaders. And it's a sort of a starting process. So we started to talk about outdoor leaders first, and we're going to start looking then at how outdoor leaders are educated about nutrition. And then we'll start sort of delving a bit more deeply into program provision and those sort of things as well as time unfolds. But from our perspective, we looked at one major provider down in Victoria, and we investigated their food practices of the outdoor educators that work for them. And excuse me, I will be looking at another screen, and I can share you the link to the paper as well. I'll put it in the chat. And ultimately, what the reality was when we looked into this research, it has major implications for outdoor leaders, from the cognitive capacity in terms of when you become nutrient deficient. It has an adverse impact on your capacity to make decisions. That has implications for your safety and your judgment and your decision making. Also from a health and well-being scenario. So as you've all probably experienced, you go out week after week after week and you're eating the same food over and over and over again. Great for the students, but for you yourself, Dave Maskell, I can imagine you've had many a similar meal over and over and over again. It leads to long-term nutrient deficiency. And that has massive implications, especially if you stay in the field for a long time, but even for a short period of time, it has implications for you. So we sort of started to look at, well, what are they? What leads to that? And we identified sort of 3 primary factors that lead to some issues associated to staff, particularly around their food accessibility and what they were eating, and how that we might start thinking about a change in what we provide for staff and what we can do to enable that. And ultimately, the food decisions that staff were making were around food limitations. So if you have issues associated to dietary requirements, religious requirements, just a sense of what food you do like and don't like, and whether that matches up with what's provided. So that's one key area, what food limitations are available to you and what implications there are for you. And that links also to the freshness and the quality of the food. It links also to your personal preferences. So your beliefs associated to the food choices and the practices associated to that. Now, the practices on the food choices is also thinking about nutritional levels. What's in this meal for me? What can I take? What will be beneficial to me? Do I feel like it today? Do I need this? How much longer does it take to prepare it? Those sort of things. And then there's the social context. So how it's made, who's preparing it, how many times we've all had a metho meal at some stage, I'm sure, and the implications of that and the hygiene associated to those things as well, whether students have washed their hands, how much dirt's gone in, how much sand. I know I've got a chipped tooth from eating sand from a student's a meal at some stage. So those all have massive implications, and all of that's going on around while you're trying to manage a group, and all those things have implications for it. Now, some of the conflicting factors and some of those things that contribute to that are that when you're working for companies, they're providing menus and they're providing meals and they're doing their best with a whole heap of things going on. And what menu managers were reporting back to us was that, and the food caterers were reporting back to us, quite often food's still coming back. Even though they've provided all this wonderful food for Ellen, and Ellen's asked for it particularly, it's still coming back unopened, still in its package, and they're asking questions. So that has implications from a financial context as well. So that adds into the food limitations. Eventually an employer goes, well, I've provided Pete with his wonderful gourmet meals every week, and Pete's sending half of it back. So why should I continue this sort of this process? Now, coming out of all of that, so they're the implications, and that's on program. So they're the implications that occur on program. So that has a nutrient deficit, often eating the same meals and not getting rich nutrient-based foods. Implications for their health and well-being, and just that sense of fatigue associated from a safety perspective. And that social context, well, I'm not eating it because of, I'm not too sure about the kids and how they've cooked it and whether I'm happy to eat it. But the other side of that is then the decision-making around that outdoor leaders have when they come off program. So, which compounds the nutrient deficit that they've had on program. Now, I'm sure all of you have probably come off program at some stage and headed straight to the pub and had the palmy, and then had a big breakfast the next morning, and then a half a dozen more beers and the pizza and that sort of thing. And then you're back out on program again on Monday. Now, maybe you haven't, but I know for a fair period of my time, I was doing that. So you have this cycle. So that just compounds the whole process. And that's what leads to some of that nutrient deficiency over a long period of time. So, and now when I say a long period of time, that can only just be 12 months and even shorter periods, especially if you're if your body, especially things like iron, those sort of things that have, a fluctuating scenario, if they're low, then it doesn't take much to compound those things. So you've got 2 competing factors. One, the on-program stuff, the food limitations, personal preference, social context, and then the off-program stuff, which are compounded by it, and the decisions made around those. And there's also a cost scenario too. Well, I haven't eaten all week very well, so I'll go and spend lots of money, but then it kind of has this sort of flip-flop effect for you. What that leads to is, I guess, what we found was what we need to be doing is improving the nutritional knowledge, I guess, of the catering managers in terms of what are nutrient beneficial foods and working with them. What are the decision making and the implications for staff? So talking to staff and actually going, well, your decision is not to eat this may only impact you today, but it actually has an impact on you long term. So what do we need to do in terms of education around those outdoor leaders? And that's where we're starting the next phase of the project, looking at what are outdoor leaders getting trained about their nutritional knowledge. So we're surveying outdoor educators from La Trobe University and also Sunshine Coast University, and looking at what they know about nutrition and what's their level of knowledge and their literacy associated to nutrition, and then looking at what they're getting taught about nutrition, and then starting a phase of, well, what can we do better? Because what we've found out so far is that most people's nutrition knowledge is actually pretty low. We've got the food pyramid, we've got a few other things. Yeah, I need to put more in than I put out, that sort of stuff. But actually what is beneficial and how much is beneficial is sort of a little bit of a area that's pretty grey. So there's a high level of perceived knowledge of nutrition, but there's a lack of actual true literacy around nutrition. So that's where we sort of started the process next. That's a snapshot, but hopefully that makes sense, Pete, and everybody else. And happy to take questions, and I'll find that link and I'll paste it for you.
Thanks very much, Brendon, for a very insightful and in-depth insight into your research. I always continually get inspired by this man's knowledge of things around the subject, the wider subject of outdoor education, and I have the pleasure of working alongside of him at USC. I'll open it up to the room to begin a conversation, and perhaps we can field some questions to Brendon in the initial part.
I think that Ellen had a really good point that she put over in the chat. She said safety requirements around allergy anaphylaxis, meaning that staff are limited in what food they can bring on program to supplement the food provided, can create complications. So say, especially like if you are a vegetarian or vegan, nuts, I think, are usually often a big source of protein. But then if you have somebody with a nut allergy, then you can't bring any nuts. So then what are the alternatives to doing to that kind of option?
And I guess that's the next one of the phases of sitting with the nutritional, like the people that are designing the menus and having a conversation and sort of training. So often they're dealing with 100 students and all of their scenarios. Unfortunately, the staff are the second one, so you might get served up, and what was found, something fairly bland and not beneficial, and that's what leads to that nutritional sort of deficit. So yeah, there's some work to be done around working with the catering staff.
It definitely adds complications, because the temptation is just to remove, in that space, to remove all allergens, always, ever. And you end up with no ingredients left.
Yeah, and that was something that was reported quite often. Oh, you know, they've given me virtually nothing, and everyone else is having this, if it's there, really nice meal, and I'm like, do you know what? You know, tofu, that's kind of nice. 5 days a week.
Tofu out of a cardboard box, even better.
Yeah, that's it. So those sort of things become problematic, and that's what, you know, we're human. We like food and we enjoy it, and there's that safety of it, having it, but when it's the same thing made it multiple times, it becomes problematic.
Did you come across any complications regarding centres that or, you know, organisations that are following obviously your commercial kitchen rules, and then operating, you know, they're operating in the field, and that severely limits them in what they will send out in the field around meats, cheeses, you know, and so to manage that?
Yeah, there's certainly an increase in that. Probably talking, and this is probably more anecdotal, but it was evident in this with this one study. But where previously things were just sent out, put in eskies at the food drop, everybody was happy. But now that there's regulations around, well, it has to be kept at this temperature. It only has to be allowed for X hours out of a refrigerator to here. And to do a food drop, it could be sitting there, you know, on my food drop run, it's 5 hours, and I dropped yours first, Ellen. So you don't get it. So then nobody gets it. So that is certainly one of the implications that's come in, and an increased implication. So some organisations just have shifted totally to sort of dehydrated meals, or the prepackaged ones, which then has massive implications for, you know, waste, and even that social aspect of cooking. You know, one of the best things of outdoor ed, and I know working with Pete last year, and probably all of you experienced it with COVID, that idea of just boiling water and tipping it in and that's dinner is pretty non-satisfactory, or certainly not socially engaging.
I now work with a residential program where the kids go out week after week, and the space to teach about nutrition and their ability to control their own choices is huge. And there's so much potential there, but there are so many hurdles.
Yeah. So, and I guess that's where we're looking at, well, how do we, because it's such a major factor of a lot of programs, and it's kind of an reduced consideration. Like there's a recent article that's actually talking about the travel to programs and how does that serve as a third place in terms of education. So there's all this sort of hidden curriculum and subculture to what's going on the bus on the way to and from. And there's also a big part of Out the Red is probably around the Trangia circle and that discussions that are associated to it. But it's not in goals and aims and those sort of things. So how do we bring that to the forefront and actually say, well, this is beneficial. This is a good place to talk about it. An older colleague of mine who I used to work with for a long time, Andrew Brooks, used to talk sometimes about Out the Red just being about good night's sleep, good food, and spending time in the bush. For a lot of kids, that's not a bad pathway.
Yeah, there's so much life learning potential.
Yeah.
And food is one that's often overlooked.
Yeah.
Can I, a lovely segue into the first burning question that we posted for tonight's discussion. How are you using catering or your food service as a learning component of your program? So is it implicitly part of the program in terms of intentional programming design? You're going to cook on Trangias to allow the students to go on a more adventurous led journey further on in their sequentialness, or are they cooking on barbecues because that's what the school wants and it's easy? I'd love to hear from people in the room.
I've been on a few trips actually, with uni mostly, and then with Oj, and I've done a couple of different styles, and it really affects the tone of the whole trip, the way that you do food. So we did like a canoe trip along the Murray, and that was like a very, very slow trip. Emphasis was on the food. We cooked on the fire. We used camp ovens. We spent like an hour or two prepping dinner to have this beautiful, beautiful meal. That was like anything you could cook at home and better, to, you know, being in the high plains and then just, yeah, tipping in the dehydrated meal when you're on the edge of your tarp because it's bucketing down in rain and you just kind of want to get something into you quick, and then, you know, get to sleep. But like that in itself was almost like isolating because you're not with the rest of your group having those good conversations and sort of falling into deep connection.
I have a really strong belief that food should be intentional and how we manage food should be very intentional. Like you, Mads, I've seen it have big effects in different ways. And you have the classic argument of, you know, whole group cooking versus small group cooking. You know, these things come up again and again. Very much around like, what is the purpose of today in this day? You know, like we might be in a travel day to get to an expedition, so we have a barbecue. We might be, you know, as you said, you might be on the lightweight section last day of a 4-day journey and you just need to lose weight. So that might be a dehydrated meal just being, but yeah, I've always been a big fan of a Trangia circle and an evening conversation, throwing some questions out there. Some of the best work I've seen with facilitators just stirring up conversations at dinner time to see what's going on with the group, and listening. And, you know, sometimes the whole plan for the next day happens without even needing to debrief. Like there is so much potential and, you know, around how you use it, how you educate, you know, what are you trying to achieve with your trip? It's about understanding your goal and your aim of your expedition, and where your priorities lay. To me,
I think it's also quite interesting to sort of ponder that some people just more like what they like to eat at home isn't necessarily like a flavorful dish of like, you know, all these variety of foods. Like some people very much have like meat, veg kind of vibe, or like pasta, and, you know, being in the outdoors is like a good opportunity to sort of explore, you know, we're in this different environment, let's explore different food as well and how wonderful that can be. I would be curious to know other people's opinions on what place you think foraging has the potential to have in a program.
I mean, I think for kids that's or younger kids, that's a bit more difficult. Just because you've got to really knowing what you're eating and what you're encouraging them to eat. I've been a part of adult programs that do that type of foraging, and then using those, what you find, you bring back and they actually cook with it. So I think it's a really awesome way to learn about the environment and get that kind of experience. But I think it would be really difficult with younger groups. That's just my opinion of that.
I think it can be done. It depends on, I suggest, the time frame of the program and how much time you have to teach those skills. I think if the program is set up around Indigenous foods and bush tucker, then you can do an amazing amount with that area. But the program needs to be have devoted time, because it's to teach the skills of foraging and then to teach the skills of cooking in a traditional Indigenous way is a fairly long and time-consuming process till people get adept at it.
So yeah, it's an interesting one. Even like we used to run programs that looked at the bioregion, or that you could only buy things, the food was only anything that's in season currently in your area. So those sort of stuff. So the students would have to go and buy food and associated to that. So that brings in a whole heap of different sort of realities to understanding the location that they're in and what is growing here. And then that raised questions around, well, what Indigenous capacity is there to access food in this area? And we used to talk to some Indigenous people that would talk about, well, different times of year, there'd be a phenomenal amount. And I think there's a real opportunity now where I am on the sunny coast to consider the Indigenous implications for the food that they source. There was a school program over in WA that used to go to, I think it was the Abrolhos Islands or certain islands, and they used to send their students with a bag of rice and their fishing rods. And that's it. It's either fish or rice and fish. So that was a big part of their program. So their whole program was around that idea of, well, how much energy do we expend to, to consume the food? So I think it needs to be intentional. We used to use a lot of camp ovens on certain programs, and we used to use fires. Certainly with used to use youth at risk. We used to always use fires, because there's a certain element of understanding safety associated to using fires and how to do it. But also that aspect of service to others, that idea that you're preparing a meal for somebody else, or you're having a meal prepared for you that that might not often happen for you. The idea of, for certainly some students, they might never have had a meal prepared to them in a way that's caring and understanding and sufficient. So that aspect comes into it as well.
Awesome. Hey, Sean, would you like to expand on your food miles comment that you said, also learning about food miles?
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to. This day and age, global warming and all these sorts of factors going on, I think incorporate a variety of things. You can talk about food miles in there, and the fact that, as we were talking about, as Brendon was saying, local required food and food that is in season. And you can obviously also bring in gardening aspect as well. I guess in some ways, is one way you can reduce food miles is by actually having a garden. Now, you may not supply your whole year with food, but you supplement. So I think, and I love that idea of buying what's in season. And as far as Indigenous, now I'm in central Victoria. As far as tucker goes, bush tucker, there's not a great amount. So, at this stage, but, I love the idea if there's an opportunity to bring that in, it's really good, because it does, hard to get some stats, but some of the food we eat is just, wow, that's come a long way for us to eat. Yeah, I guess that's my sort of thought about it. Yeah.
That's a really good point. I think I was recently looking at, I can't remember if it was a meme or something like that, but it was talking about how It was like Brazilian avocados that were packaged in Thailand, but then they were selling them in the US. So it's like the amount of miles that avocado or whatever it was had to go to get to you. It just seems counterproductive that we are, you know, sending them so far just to get something when we can get something closer.
Well, even in Australia, is a good example is that in northern Western Australia, there's the Kununurra that has quite a bit of food bowl. They actually grow quite a bit there. It goes down to Melbourne to be sold to everyone, and then they take it back to Darwin, which is close, or the actual town Kununurra or Broome. So some of those aspects that we can sort of point out can go, well, you know, because I worked up there for a bit, is that, as you said, same example, you know, it's being grown here, taken there to be packaged, and then delivered to whatever shop you decide to buy it from. And that's, well, as we know, that's not sustainable, really. Yeah.
And I think, Sean, it brings in that another aspect of the packaging that we carry out on programs associated to the food that we're carrying, and the recyclability of it, the composting of it, all those sort of things. And we're now carrying compost tubes and those sort of things and going through a whole process of recycling. It's still amazing how much waste is generated from that. And even like I used to, students, when preparing them for like a 20-day trip, they would sit down and they would put everything into single Ziploc bags. And, you know, 40 students for 20 days, you know, it's hundreds and hundreds of Ziploc bags. And so just so sort of that level of education as well around what that looks like and the implications of it. And for a big organisation, I can imagine, like, you know, OEG and some of those places, if they were to follow that practice, how easily it is to replicate it to the thousands and the millions of Ziploc bags in a year. So,
but as you said, it's a waste. You're not teaching your students much. You're just saying there's all this waste. But I will say thank you. I'll be incorporating the compost tubes into my journey programs. Love it.
Yeah, they're great. Yeah, and
great idea.
It's just it's a really simple way of, you know, recognizing how much we've eaten and what we're wasting, and then but also saying, well, let's just not throw it out. Let's do something with this. So we're actually looking at another project at the moment, and it's probably preempted by the fact that Pete probably had a couple of foxes in his camps recently that were attracted to the food, and we're looking at working with national parks around the implications of our behaviour in those locations and the implications of the, you know, our food usage and lack thereof, and the impacts on those locations that we work in.
Yeah, well, not only the foxes, but the native wildlife as well, of course. Yeah.
Going along the same lines that we're talking about here, I think this is a really good time to bring up, I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but with COVID, being a Girl Guides leader, we were no longer allowed to bring like large bags of food. The only food we were allowed to bring was individually packaged foods. And that was like a big COVID thing because you couldn't share. I don't know if anybody else has experienced that in different areas, but that one kind of killed me because of all the waste that then you have of all those individually packaged things.
Yeah, definitely in the programs I'm working in at the moment, there's a organizational policy that suggests that you shouldn't share food either between students or staff. So basically, it takes all of that community living that people were referring to previously out of the equation. And even if you are sitting in a trangia circle, everyone's sitting around cooking individual little meals in a trangia circle. So it's, from that perspective, it doesn't build community around food. It almost isolates people around the food experience. Thoughts on that?
I agree with you wholeheartedly, and you know, and one of my theories on some journey programs are very much make the kids walk 20 Ks and all this and that. My theory is you do your walk, you feel the success, but part of that is setting your tents together. Part of that is cooking together. That's a huge, you know, I think it's almost in our genetics as a community species that, you know, cooking together, and the fact that 3 together on a trangia cook a meal together, that's what it's about. And as said earlier, I can't even said it, but just being in the bush, you know, so I really, I really hope we can get to a stage where it's definitely back to community cooking. And that's something I'm really looking for, because that's as important as the walk. That's as important as sleeping in a tent. And as being mentioned, good food. You know, a lot of people in the past, you associated camping food and it's terrible. But, you know, as we know, as people in our field, you can actually have really delicious meals out there and love it, you know. So that's how I feel about what you said, Pete. Thank you.
One of the areas I think I've seen intentional food was, and I struggled with it initially as an instructor or a facilitator of the experience, was the big camp oven chicken or roast, because it becomes part of your program in a big way. You've got to have the fire going 2 to 3 hours before you're ready to eat the meal. You've got to have good weather conditions to be able to do it. You've got to manage the risk of moving pots full of food carefully on and off the fire, whether that's with year 7s or year 9s or year 11s, because you're definitely still involved, very much hands-on, as probably more so than a transient circle where you can sit back and give a solid briefing and then manage risk as you're going. Yeah, COVID's definitely changed it. I've seen less of those types of styles of menus recently since that.
I think earlier we were talking about kind of the learning aspects of the cooking circles, and one thing that I really like the small cooking circles of like different groups cooking for themselves, just because it teaches a lot of responsibility about the food you're cooking, and then that you have to eat it, and then how you cook your food. Like then you can see how other people are doing it, and learning a lot of aspects of it's not just you know, the big questions, but teaching those small skills that a lot of kids don't learn how to cook at home, and they don't learn how to use a knife and without cutting themselves. And I think that's a really good opportunity to be around hot ovens or hot things, and then kind of learn those basic things of don't touch it, it's hot. And then just kind of learning different ways to cook, because you see how other people do it, because maybe they have learned or something. And I'm a big, I really like to cut things up small so that it cooks quicker. So I would always encourage, when I had like group cooking, I would always encourage the kids to cut up things really small so that it would cook faster. Otherwise they do these big, huge chunks and then it would just take forever. And so I just think little things like that, just those basic life skills that they can learn. We did it with the Girl Guides recently, and I had, you know, 10-year-olds, a group of 10-year-olds cooking, and I made them do everything themselves. I was like, they're like, are you going to show us how to do that? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to show you how to do it. I'll guide you. And then afterwards, you know, when their parents picked them up, I told their parents, hey, by the way, your daughters know how to cook a spaghetti bolognese. So you can use that however you want.
Yeah, I remember working with one program, they gave them a menu card. So whoever was the group's cooking that night, they were given that menu card and they got to take it home with all the ingredients, and then with the idea that they cook that for their family on the return. I agree, Rob Saxon, I agree with your comments there about, you know, that foraging. I haven't done so much of it here in Australia, but I worked with some ladies from Norway that were doing it with their prep kids. So going fishing and cooking the fish on a fire and that sort of stuff. Quite amazing, and foraging for berries. And, you know, it just makes sense that if it's an available resource, why would you carry heaps of stuff if you can get it from a stream right there in front of you? So, and to add some of those things to your meal would be, yeah, quite amazing. So, I think that notion of the community aspect is something I've lost in the last 12 months, that sitting down, and it's a real sort of downside to COVID and a missed opportunity. But those tangible, using a knife for the first time, cooking, getting that meal, and also that benefit of, especially when it's been hard, like it's been a long day, getting that morale boosting, wow, this meal actually tastes really good. You also do find out some other things about students, how well they can hide things they don't want to eat, that sort of stuff. I remember working with a group of boys in the country over in WA, working in a river area, and they would be burying the broccoli and that sort of stuff in the sand and all that sort of stuff. It's like, where's the broccoli? Don't know. And then you'd go through and clean up afterwards and kick the sand about, and you'd find all the broccoli hidden in the dirt. And but it is, yeah, I think, I'm not sure it can never be written into the national curriculum or anything like that. That's a debate that's going on at the moment, but it's certainly a key aspect and should be made more of it. So.
What I guess something that I've always found with outdoor ed is that it's so bottomless, and therefore your expertise and knowledge of your team directs what you can do and what you can share and what you can teach. And so you touched on it back at the beginning. You talked about how good is your staff's knowledge about nutrition, because your staff need to know before they can share it with students. How good are they at cooking? Because if they can't cook, then they can't teach your kids how to cook well, or they can't guide them, or be like, I've got a great tip, this would be amazing. If they don't know about the local Indigenous flora or fauna, then they can't share that. There's, if they don't understand food miles, or it's just this, it's so cool. We can do so much, and I never stop learning, and I love that. And most of the staff that I work with love it as well. It's just this bottom, as you said, it's not contained. Like outdoor education is not really contained in any way about the direction that you can take it in and the value that you can gain from it. But it also makes it this like enormous, ever expanding, like where to, wonderful opportunity with, never ending learning. With never-ending challenges as well.
I think that's kind of in our last session, we were talking about the different certificates that people have to have, or the different little aspects of it, of whether they should have Indigenous culture training, or if they should have this kind of training and this kind of training. And it's kind of that idea, like you're saying, that like this would be a great training to have. But then, where does it end? Because you can't cover everything. But I just thought those are really good tie back to kind of what we were talking about last week about the different aspects of what you should be teaching leaders. And then, what basics can you teach them without having to do a full course on it?
And it comes back to intentionality. My really big question that came up at the beginning is, Brendon, did you have any joy in discovering how to educate the caterers when they are not the outdoor educators?
Well, to some point, but they're restricted by budget, time and availability and resourcing. And outdoor educators being outdoor educators, often they were finding that people weren't submitting their requests till too late. Like things were ordered in a big batch, weeks in advance, and sorry, we'll just have to make something up. So where they were positive, it was because the staff were informed about what they needed and what would be beneficial, and submitted good requests and good ideas and that sort of stuff, and they worked with them. But often they were constrained by budget, time and availability. So the key sort of areas. And I think it's an ongoing, and often if it's an outsourcing away from the outdoor ed company, it's just brought in, that becomes even more problematic. So especially when the bottom line sort of drives what they provide. But I think that's another iteration further into the research. How do you work with those people to sort of establish things? But I think as outdoor educators become more aware and have a greater nutritional literacy, I think that will drive some of those things. So
one of the things I did, I guess, off my bat when I was a manager of a venue down in Victoria for a large organisation down there that some of us have worked for, was I went and did a food handlers course. And I don't know if it was part of my job, but it was, I think, a day or two. And it gave me a little bit of an insight into, but mostly hygiene practices and the things we were doing poorly within the centre that I was running. And we fixed those pretty quickly. So we were compliant with legislation where it was relevant. But I think something like that, but with a pivoted focus on how do you do sort of some of the things we've been talking about tonight, chop up your food really small for a transit meal, have these type of bits of equipment for a large cooking camp oven type meal. I don't know, what are people's feelings or thoughts on that? Do you think there's a need for a training package out of this discussion?
I'm not sure if it's a
Go, Pete. I'll throw in my 2 cents worth. I think that it's largely common sense. Having said that, I'd put the onus back on perhaps organizations to train their staff as to how they want them to run the catering aspect of the organization, and that it is as important as running any other aspect of the programming part of the organization that I could see. So if that involves some training in and around what good food is, and perhaps some basic sort of recipe kind of, putting together type of things, or perhaps some skills in knife handling and that sort of thing, then I think it can only add value to your program and the food experience on the program. But in a time poor industry, do we have time for that? Shall I just also pose the question, is high quality food on program that has variety, is it expensive? And is that one of the barriers between delivering that type of food to staff and clients?
I catered for 6 years for a school who ran out to red from year 3 to year 10. And I fed everyone on $13 a day on average. And I mean, it wasn't expensive for us.
I think
What was it? Was that like predominantly fresh? Was it, what does $13 a day? Yeah. What does that look like?
I was going to say, Pete, Dave, they've eaten our menus. We got lots and lots of good feedback. I can say it's probably one of my major points of pride of things that I've been involved in. I inherited an amazing menu and continued to build on it. And we got our meat fresh straight from the butcher. We got it vacuum sealed straight from the butcher. He froze it straight away. We kept it on ice. We went for fresh every time we could manage it. We were quite rigid. We gave recipes with amounts, out to staff and students. We packed it all for them. And then we told them we don't want any of it back. Be as creative and inventive as you want. And then we put in some other things like, here's the return basket. Anyone can raid that bucket. So if your group doesn't want that food, put it in that bucket. If your group needs food, come raid that bucket. That's all sort of fair game. Let's, try and work the balance of this food wastage.
That's an interesting point you made, Ellen. And that was one of the things that came up in the research with staff, was how they had to be flexible in how they use the food that was provided to them. So if organisations were clear and demonstrated a good knowledge of, well, these go with these meals and these go with these meals, and they had good planning around it, it was quite simple. But if there wasn't, it was just this, here's your box, Pete, away you go. Here you go, Steve, you do your best for the next week, and work out what it all looks like. Everyone ate all the great stuff for the first couple of days, and then come Friday, it's down to boiled rice and a little bit of pasta if you're lucky, and maybe some soy sauce. So those structures certainly enabled better sort of responses to enabling that sort of thing, but also decisions about, well, what do we put in, what do we leave out? No one ate that yesterday, so I'm not going to put it in today. And then there's this kid carrying around a sweet potato for 5 days going, why do I have this sweet potato? For crying out loud. So, but I think you're right in the sense that Pete, to respond to your question, I don't think it's anywhere near that much more expensive. Mainly it's about accessibility and a desire to sort of say, there's a little bit more to do with fresh stuff. There's a little bit more to do, and a sense of, if it's done well, students have a great meal. If it's done poorly, it's still probably better than, a fairly bland pasta with a bit of sauce chucked on the side.
I think it also goes along with the same lines of that, the idea of education around food and how to prepare food, and the creative use of spices to make the same meal taste very different. I think it is a big part of it. And I think that's one thing that maybe a lot of outdoor programs probably don't do very well, is the spice category, and giving options to flavor things so that it's not just all tasting the same, or all the same bases of, not all tomato based or soy based or whatever it is.
It probably fits to that other idea of the right amount of quantity as well. actually balancing it out so that if you've got a group of Year 9 boys, you actually have enough to feed them, and that as staff, you don't miss out on it. Like you're standing there on the sides going, guess I'm going into my own kit and seeing what I've carried just so I don't miss out. So, yeah, I know, like a great example was Explorers over in WA. They always catered to 20, and it meant that you had too much sometimes, but it always meant that you had enough, and their foods were quite phenomenal. And going back to that, it's that conversation with the parents who have spent $500 to send this child on this trip, and what did we eat? Black and gold pasta. You know, it's sort of you've got to then have a question, especially from a fiscal scenario. So,
Brendon, your point about having an unorganized menu and just giving it to the group to manage, it resonates with me, and I've experienced those type of programs, and they are very frustrating because usually the food is not programmatically put into the program as we're going to need 2 to 3 hours to work out how we're going to manage our food for the week somewhere on the first day. So we can't just be doing 3 activities and then get to camp and set up tents and dig a toilet and then start thinking about dinner at 7 o'clock, because you'll go to the easy option straight away. So it's definitely something that becomes very problematic or programmatic, getting my words mixed up, but it needs to work like that. I think if you've got that type of model, and I think less and less those models exist in at least Southeast Queensland. What do folks in other parts of the country feel and see?
Sorry, Dad, I'm with you there, and obviously we've all had that experience of, you know, second last day where the food is pretty grim. I think that's where obviously, if you're in the opportunity to sequential programs with the same clients, you can obviously build to the point where it almost be that the kids or the students or whoever are actually planning their own meals, I guess. So, you know, as Ellen said, you know, it's bottomless. You know, so many things that can happen in the outdoor ed industry, so many things you can do, and it's almost like there's no bottom, as you said. And I think that's something that's really valuable. Maybe, as you said, you know, you can't just go 3 activities and bam, you know, you get them in the afternoon. Easy food is a lead up to that. Yeah, as you say, you know, every program needs to be facilitated well. If you just hand them a whole lot of food and say good luck with no experience, you're not really setting them on a very positive path.
Can I suggest that few program designers, no pun intended, cater time for food management at the start and the end of program? And I think a quality program, particularly a long program, needs time for leaders and students to actually sit about and talk through the food they're going to eat over the 20 days and their menu, and get their head around it and actually sort it out so that the people who are using it, are going to actually know where it is and where they can access it.
I developed a love for stuff sacks when it came to packing food myself.
But as David pointed out, in a jam-packed first day where you're trying to run 2 other activities, it's hard to eke out that time to manage, you know, and you need a couple of hours on a busy program, particularly with a sort of menu which has variety in it, and you're doing lots of different styles of cooking.
One thing that I experienced when I did programs is I won't lie, I took a lot of control of the food, because I'm a very food motivated person. And there were several times where when I didn't do it, and then I'd end up, like we talked about, I wouldn't end up eating very much because, you know, I wasn't managing it. And the kids weren't managing it. And so you get the kids who would take more than others, and then it would leave people without. And so I would always be the type that would go, okay, well, I don't really need that much, and give it up. So I think that, yeah, if we had more opportunity for these to kind of and get a better understanding of how food works. And once again, the idea that Sean was saying, if the if the kids could plan their own meals and then have a better understanding of how that food works and how to plan for that, like just think of the planning that goes into something as simple as that, and the coordination and stuff. And so all those skills that you're then teaching by helping those kids plan that. So maybe it's something, even if you have a jam-packed day, the first day you would take control of that, but then find ways to maybe intentionally put it into your planning later in the week. Like, okay, I'll do it for you tonight. You guys saw what I did. Now, what can you guys learn from that, and how can you do it yourselves?
I actually was recently, Sheree, on a program where the students every night they had like a certain budget and they had to design their menu, and we went shopping. It was like a cycle tour style trip. So we cycled to towns, and then in that town, then part of the program was that they spent a couple of hours going shopping, buying food, and then to kind of like, I don't know, almost motivate them to make like really good meals, we set up a master chef competition, and we kind of had like a rating system, made it really fun. And the students cooked some really impressive meals, and we had some great conversations actually around, why would you choose this over this? Like something as simple as I was with the students when they were choosing between the microwavable rice. They'd need like 6 or 7 packets for the whole group. And I said, but you could just buy a 2-kilo rice. We have time to cook it. And then you're only using 1 packet. And they were like, oh, true. And then, it comes into other things like budget and stuff. It was pretty cool, like learning experience. I think a lot of them got a fair amount out of it.
I might just bring the conversation back to challenges in meeting dietary challenge requirements for clients and staff. As an outdoor education cross-section here, do we do it well, or do we have room to improve, do we think?
I've probably personally gone from what I think was some of the best provision for dietary requirements to some of the worst, as I've transitioned in jobs, unfortunately, and organizations. So I've seen it done pretty averagely. And I was thinking about cost of food, and the cost of food is not expensive, but the time required to design a good menu, to educate yourself and your team, to find the right providers, the suppliers, to put in the detailed orders is time consuming, and people's time costs money, as well as systems as well. And we're going back to that, giving that feedback on what do people need in a timely fashion, so all those things can be done on time. So respecting people's time as well, to me is a big drawback in dietary stuff, but across the board, I've seen it done, to answer your question generally, spectacularly well and spectacularly lackluster.
I'll jump back in. I used to work for OEG, as most of you know. They at least made a really good effort. They're one of the better providers for massively big, complex programs with food and catering, lots of food tubs and eskies. But they did a thing where, for a couple of years there, I'm not sure if it's still happening, where they actually rotated the menus over the season. So you had a winter menu and a summer menu. And that made such a difference to me and the way I dealt with food in expedition mode, because it meant that you're eating food that was going to warm you up in the winter when you were cold coming off a river, as opposed to having sausages on a barbecue. So that was a great example. But again, I'm similar to Alan, worked in lots of different places, and some places do it really poorly and don't even think about it because it's a cost factor, and they just want to get them in and out of the catering area or in or out of the dining hall really quickly, or it's not accounted for in the field. Other thoughts and ideas?
Yeah, I'll throw in for a sec. I've had a similar experience. I mean, I think some organizations do food really well and have spent the time and invested the energy and the money into the procedures and methods around catering and food. And other organizations think of it as an afterthought. And unfortunately, that's what it comes, and that's unfortunate because I think the programming suffers as a result of poor quality food. So they're my thoughts.
I think in all of these things, it's a little bit like the person that looks after the shed. You need someone is the champion. If you go into programs that the shed is just, you know exactly where it is. It's kind of, you need that person also, or someone that has, where I've seen it done well, it's usually someone that has a dietary requirement that they're like, right, I've got to make this good for me, so I'm going to make it good for everybody instead of letting it go. And if it's not, then maybe it comes back to that sort of notion of nutritional literacy. If it's just another one of my jobs, I've got to pack the climbing kit, I've got to pack this, I've got to pack that. Oh yeah, I've got to do food. It kind of falls by the wayside. And what's the lowest common denominator? I remember working for one company where, you know, they were feeding Year 9 boys, and you know, their breakfast was those. You remember those catering packs? Everyone got one of those catering packs. You know, and it destroyed the program. The boys couldn't go do anything, and yeah, I think it comes down to who's the champion and do they have the resources to be able to do it well. And if they do, then it's usually fantastic. If they don't, then it's a hard job.
Any other thoughts on this great topic, food?
I just think that there's so much opportunity for collaboration with food from, you know, all over the world. Like delicious, flavoursome food from so many places can be done quite easily through camping style. You just got to know how to do them right, or maybe have the instructions there that help you do it. I think that there's lots of inspiration we can draw from everywhere.
I'm gonna throw the controversial hand grenade in at the last minute. Dessert, is it a requirement?
Sometimes. 5 days a week, Dave. 5 days a week.
Or is it a chocolate bar that you have?
Why else am I out on program if I'm not eating 7 blocks of chocolate in a week? Seriously.
I think chocolate bar.
Every second night.
Yeah, definitely a requirement to have dessert. You burn a lot of calories. You need those extra calories.
No, all the washing up is horrendous. It goes on for hours with Year 9 boys.
Now it comes down to flexibility, like of how often, you know, is it there every night? You know, what is it? Can you mix them up according to your needs, your time? You know, if you don't need to wash, don't do it that night. But I think like food lifts mood. Food, you know, can make a bad day amazing, and dessert can add to that.
There's no doubt. I agree, Ellen, with that. I was actually having a conversation with one of my fantastic staff members today in regards to that. And there's also the aspect, I guess, of putting sugar into these kids before bedtime.
Cook earlier.
Well, yeah, good point. We were talking about it. We're like, well, maybe they have their sweets like an afternoon, keep you kicking, and then do like a hot chocolate at night. So there's a bit of sweetness, a bit of nice, but it's not that hyping them up as such. Don't get me wrong. Like I want to do chocolate bananas on the coals. That's my dessert jam, you know. But yeah, they can get pretty hyped up, excited, especially if you got, you know, as we all know, teenage boys as a group. It's yeah.
I think there's something in that, Sean, the idea of, you know, I know a bloke that used to go to the restaurants that used to let their kids have dessert first. It's like, well, you know, we're going out for something nice, so why not make it special? Have your dessert first. How good's camping? We get dessert first. All right. There's your marshmallows.
It's actually pretty cool.
There goes your marshmallows. There goes your, you know, what was it, those farm baked biscuits that we used to pour the thickened cream into, and then they delve in there with their hand. I reckon, Rob, your question's a really important one, and we've probably, it's probably something that we miss, especially now with programs that are bringing in people considerably more from Middle Eastern backgrounds and especially in the Sudanese and those sort of ones, how we're catering for menus like that. I think it's well off most organisations' radars, and unless you're working with a specific group, it's a really, you know, it's probably something that most of us would be missed or not really know what to do. I've worked with Singaporeans quite a lot, but they have certainly a high food literacy, but to say some of the other areas, I'm not too sure. But I'm connected to quite a few international schools. So Rob, if you want, I can see what maybe some of them provide and what they do and give you some feedback.
One of the best things I ever did around food was we had a group in WA and we had a food forum. We had a food summit as, you know, a community of outdoor educators, and just, we could probably do it more often or do it on larger scales, just sharing ideas, like just pooling amongst what everyone has, I think is the best way. And I've never ever, I don't like to cook. And just like what you did just then, asking for the ideas and sharing and using those contacts is invaluable. As I said, I catered for 6 years and I'm actually not a very good cook, but I got lots and lots of feedback and ideas from other people that helped enormously.
I think you give your cooking skills a necessarily hard time, Ellen Barker. I've eaten some of your food and I'm still living, and I think those meals were quite good. Lots of variety and nutrition as well. I'll just remind people that it is the end of the recorded session. Thank you very much for this lively and interactive discussion on food and everything associated with it. As always in the Outhouse, we can go further and farther on pretty much every topic we ever bring inside. Thanks very much. Tell your friends about our forum. You're quite welcome to stay inside and continue the chat. This is just the time we stop the official recording, and then we can chat more candidly, as it were.